Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of something greater than yourself. You feel small, unworthy, perhaps even uncertain if you belong here at all. You look at the world, at others who seem stronger, wiser, more equipped, and then a quiet thought creeps in. Could God ever choose someone like me? The trouble with our thinking is that we assume God picks his people the way the world does. The world looks for credentials, intelligence, wealth, strength. But God, he looks for something deeper, something far simpler, a heart willing to trust him. If you look at history, you'll notice something quite odd. The ones God chooses are rarely the ones you'd expect. A shepherd boy to be a king, a stammering man to lead a nation, fishermen to change the world. Why? Because God's power is made perfect in weakness. He does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Now you might say, but I have nothing to offer, I am not ready. But readiness is a myth. No one is ever ready when God calls. If he waited for readiness, nothing would ever begin. The question is not whether you are ready, but whether you are willing. Perhaps you are standing at the beginning of something you cannot yet see. Perhaps you feel small in the face of what's ahead. But if history has proven anything, it is this. God has never been in the business of choosing the obvious. He has always chosen the unlikely. And if he can do it for them, he can do it for you. The only thing left is your answer. Will you trust him? Many people assume that to be chosen by God, one must already be perfect, strong, wise, and without flaws. This idea is deeply ingrained in our thinking, largely because we associate being chosen with being worthy. In the world's eyes, a leader is chosen because they have proved themselves capable. A hero is celebrated because of their strength, intelligence, or ability to succeed against all odds. We are trained to believe that selection is based on qualification. But when we look at how God chooses people throughout history, we see something entirely different. God does not choose based on human standards. He does not pick the strongest warrior, the most eloquent speaker, or the person who already has everything figured out. Instead, he often calls those who feel unprepared, unworthy, and even broken. This pattern is seen repeatedly in the stories of those whom God has used in powerful ways. Moses, for example, doubted himself. He was not a natural leader. He even argued with God that he was not capable of speaking well. Yet God did not choose Moses because of his ability, but because of his willingness to obey. In choosing Moses, God demonstrated that his power is not limited by human weakness. David was another example. When the prophet Samuel was sent to anoint a new king from the sons of Jesse, everyone assumed it would be one of the strong, impressive older brothers. But God rejected them all and chose David, the youngest, a mere shepherd boy. He had no military experience, no political background, and no royal connections. Yet he was the one God called. Why? Because God does not see as man sees. He looks at the heart, not outward appearances. This principle extends throughout Scripture. The disciples of Jesus were not religious scholars or influential leaders. They were fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary men. Paul, one of the greatest apostles, was once a persecutor of Christians. Time and time again, God's chosen ones were not the people the world would have picked. This tells us something crucial. Being chosen does not mean being perfect. It means being willing to be used by God, despite imperfections. Many struggle with the idea that they could ever be chosen by God because they are painfully aware of their shortcomings. They look at their past mistakes, their fears, their failures, and assume that God would never use someone like them. This thinking is understandable but entirely wrong. The very fact that someone feels unworthy is often the very thing that makes them a candidate for God's calling. If God only used those who were already perfect, then no one would ever be chosen. But he delights in using the weak to confound the strong, the foolish to shame the wise, and the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary. It is important to realize that when God chooses someone, he does not leave them as they are, he transforms them. When he called Gideon, Gideon was hiding in fear. He did not see himself as a warrior, yet God called him a mighty man of valor. Why? Because God does not speak to us based on who we are in the moment, but who we are meant to become. His calling is not dependent on our perfection, but on His ability to work through us. Many times those who are chosen by God go through seasons of doubt and struggle. They question whether they are truly called. They wrestle with their weaknesses. But God's choice is not revoked because of insecurity or moments of failure. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, yet he was still the one chosen to lead the early church. Jonah ran from God's calling, yet he was still sent to Nineveh. Elijah performed great miracles, yet he experienced deep despair. Being chosen does not mean one will never struggle. It means that despite struggles, God's purpose remains. It is also worth noting that God's power is most clearly seen in those who acknowledge their need for Him. A person who believes they are already perfect has no room for God's work in their life. But the one who recognizes their flaws and submits to God's transformation is the one who will truly be used. Paul himself wrote that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. He did not boast in his accomplishments, but in his dependence on God. This is the true mark of being chosen, not self-sufficiency, but trust in God's sufficiency. There is a deep relief in understanding this truth. It means that no one is too broken to be used by God. No one is too weak, too flawed, or too far gone. It means that God's calling is not based on perfection, but on willingness. It means that failure does not disqualify someone from being chosen, nor does doubt. It means that anyone, no matter their past, can step into God's plan for their life. Many people hesitate to embrace God's calling because they fear they are not good enough. They believe they must fix everything first before they can be used by God. But this is not how He works. He does not wait for people to be ready. He calls them in their brokenness and makes them ready through His power. He does not look for those who have everything together, but for those who are willing to trust Him. This truth is liberating. It means that those who feel unqualified are often the very ones God wants to use. It means that weaknesses do not disqualify someone. They make room for God's strength. It means that the feeling of unworthiness is not a reason to step back, but an invitation to step forward in faith. When someone understands that being chosen does not mean being perfect, they can stop waiting for the impossible standard of perfection and start trusting that God can do His work through them as they are. They can take the first step in obedience, even if they feel afraid. They can believe that God's power is greater than their limitations. They can finally realize that their imperfections do not make them unusable, but make them the perfect canvas for God's glory. Many people believe that when God calls someone, He simply works on their behalf, making things happen while they remain passive observers. They assume that being chosen by God means receiving blessings, protection, and opportunities without effort on their part. While it is true that God is a provider, protector, and miracle worker, His way of working is far deeper than simply doing things for people. Instead, He works through them, shaping them in the process and using them as vessels for His greater purpose. Throughout history, whenever God has chosen someone, He has never just handed them success. Instead, He has partnered with them, guiding them through a process of growth, refinement, and challenge. When He called Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, He did not simply remove Pharaoh with a divine act. Instead, He sent Moses directly into the challenge, equipping him along the way. Moses had to speak, confront, and lead. God provided miracles, but Moses had to act in obedience. He had to stretch out his hand over the Red Sea, stand before Pharaoh, and endure the struggles of leadership. If God were only working for him, Moses would have had no role at all. But God was working through him, shaping him into the leader he was meant to be. This pattern is seen in nearly every story of someone chosen by God. David was anointed as king, but he was not immediately placed on the throne. Instead, he went through years of trials, running from Saul, facing battles, and experiencing hardship. These difficulties were not pointless. They were part of God's process of working through him. Each challenge refined David, strengthening his character and deepening his trust in God. The throne was not simply handed to him, he was prepared for it. If God had simply done it for him without working through him, David would have never developed into the leader he became. One of the most powerful examples of this is found in the life of the Apostle Paul. Before his conversion, Paul was a persecutor of Christians. When God called him, he did not simply transform Paul overnight and place him in a position of influence. Instead, Paul went through a long journey of growth. He faced persecution, imprisonment, and hardship. Yet through these struggles, God was working through him, using every difficulty to shape him into the man who would write much of the New Testament. Paul did not simply receive from God, he partnered with God's plan, allowing himself to be used as a vessel. This is a truth that many struggle to accept. People often pray for God to change their circumstances, remove obstacles, or bring them blessings. While there is nothing wrong with asking for God's help, it is important to understand that He does not simply hand out solutions. Instead, He works through people, developing them in the process. If someone prays for strength, God does not simply make them strong in an instant. He allows them to face challenges that develop their strength. If someone prays for patience, God does not simply make them patient overnight. He allows them to experience situations that require patience. God's way of working is not about instant results. It is about transformation. Many of the greatest lessons in life come through the process of allowing God to work through us. Growth happens in the struggle, in the moments of uncertainty, and in the willingness to trust God even when things are difficult. Those who are chosen by God are not simply handed a destiny, they are shaped into it. They do not just receive blessings, they become instruments of blessing for others. God does not just intervene on their behalf, He equips them to walk the path He has set before them. This truth is also evident in the teachings of Jesus. When He called His disciples, He did not simply give them everything they needed at once. Instead, He taught them, walked with them, and sent them out to experience ministry firsthand. He allowed them to struggle, to ask questions, to make mistakes, and to learn. He was not just working for them, He was working through them, preparing them to carry out His mission after He was gone. Even after His resurrection, He did not simply change the world Himself. He sent His followers out to do it. One of the greatest misconceptions about faith is that it is about waiting for God to act. Many people believe that if they are chosen, things will happen automatically, but God rarely works in this way. He calls people to step forward in faith even when they feel unprepared. He does not simply move obstacles out of the way, He gives people the strength to overcome them. He does not just open doors, He gives people the courage to walk through them. It is easy to look at the challenges in life and wonder why God is not doing more. People often ask why He allows difficulties, struggles, or long periods of waiting. But these seasons are often where His greatest work happens. He is not absent in these moments. He is active, working through the very circumstances that seem impossible. He is developing faith, character, and resilience. He is shaping people into who they need to become in order to fulfill their calling. This truth should change the way people see their relationship with God. Instead of simply waiting for Him to act, they should ask how He is working through their current situation. Instead of seeing challenges as obstacles, they should see them as opportunities for growth. Instead of believing that being chosen means an easy path, they should understand that it means a process of refinement and preparation. God is not looking for passive followers. He is looking for partners in His work. He does not simply pour out blessings without purpose. He entrusts people with responsibility. He does not remove every challenge. He strengthens people to face them. The greatest works of God are not just what He does for people, but what He does through them. Those who understand this will begin to see their struggles differently. They will recognize that every difficulty is an opportunity for God's work to be revealed in them. They will realize that their calling is not just about what they receive, but about who they become. Every person chosen by God has a role to play in His plan. Their journey is not just about what He gives them, but about what He does through them. He does not just change circumstances, He changes people. And through those people, He accomplishes His greatest work. Faith is often misunderstood. Many people think of it as something that comes at the end of a long journey of preparation, a requirement to be fulfilled only after everything else is in place. They believe that once they are strong enough, knowledgeable enough, or good enough, they will then be able to step forward in faith. But faith does not work that way. It is not the final step after all conditions have been met. It is the first step, taken even when nothing seems certain. Faith is the beginning, not the end of the journey with God. When God calls someone, he does not hand them a complete plan showing every detail of what is to come. He does not provide immediate proof of success or remove every obstacle before they begin. Instead, he asks them to take the first step, trusting him before they see the outcome. This pattern is seen throughout history. Abraham was called to leave his home and go to a land that God would show him. He was not given a map or an explanation, just a command to go. He had to take the first step without knowing where it would lead. If he had waited until he had all the details, he would have never moved. Moses, when called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, was not given a guarantee of success. He was not even given confidence in his own abilities. Instead, he was asked to trust that God would be with him. He had to stand before Pharaoh not with proof of victory, but with faith in what God had promised. If he had waited until he felt completely ready, he would have never gone. Faith is what moves people forward when everything in them says they are not ready. It is what allows someone to take action even when doubt is present. Many assume that faith means the absence of doubt, but that is not true. Faith often exists alongside doubt, fear, and uncertainty. It is not about being completely sure of everything, but about choosing to trust God despite not having all the answers and anxiety. When Peter stepped out of the boat to walk on water, he did not do so because he had mastered the art of walking on waves. He simply responded to Jesus' call. He took the first step while still unsure. It was only when he shifted his focus from Jesus to the storm around him that he began to sink. This is the nature of faith. It is stepping out before the water feels solid beneath your feet. Waiting for perfect conditions before taking a step of faith is a mistake. There will never be a moment when everything is perfectly lined up, when all fear is gone, and when every question has been answered. If faith required that, it would not be faith at all. True faith means moving forward despite the unknown, trusting that God will provide what is needed along the way. Many people hesitate to follow God's calling because they believe they need to fix everything about themselves first. They think they need to be stronger, holier, or more prepared. But God has never worked that way. He does not call the perfect, he perfects those he calls. He does not wait until someone is completely ready. He asks them to trust him as they go. The journey itself is what transforms them. If people waited until they felt fully qualified before stepping out in faith, no one would ever begin. This is one of the most challenging aspects of faith. It requires moving forward before feeling prepared. It demands action before certainty. But this is also what makes it so powerful. If everything was guaranteed in advance, faith would not be necessary. It is precisely because the outcome is unseen that faith has meaning. Throughout the Bible, those who accomplished great things did not start as great people. They started as ordinary individuals who simply trusted God enough to take the first step. Joshua led Israel into the Promised Land, but he had to step into the Jordan River before the waters parted. The priests carrying the ark had to walk into the water first, with no visible sign that anything would happen. The miracle came after the step of faith, not before. Faith is not just about believing in something, it is about acting on that belief. Many people say they have faith, but true faith is revealed in action. It is easy to say that one trusts God, but the real test comes when that trust requires stepping into the unknown. Faith without action is incomplete. This is why faith is the first step. It is the moment when a person chooses to trust God before seeing how everything will work out. It is when they take a risk based on God's promises rather than waiting for visible proof. Every person who has ever been used by God had to take this step. They had to move forward while still feeling unsure. They had to trust that as they walked, God would provide. The reason many never step into their calling is that they are waiting for the moment when faith is no longer needed. They want assurance before they act. They want guarantees before they commit. But God does not work that way. He asks for faith first, and then he provides what is needed. The provision, the strength, and the growth come after obedience, not before. This does not mean that faith is blind or reckless. It is not about acting without wisdom or ignoring reality. But it does mean trusting God more than circumstances. It means believing that he is in control even when the path is unclear. It means taking the first step even when the destination is not yet visible. The most beautiful thing about faith is that it grows with each step. The more someone walks in faith, the stronger it becomes. What once seemed impossible becomes a testimony of what God can do. Each step of faith builds confidence for the next one. Those who once hesitated find themselves walking boldly, not because they have all the answers, but because they have learned that God is faithful. Faith is not the final requirement, it is the beginning of everything. It is the foundation upon which God builds a life of purpose. It is the doorway to every great work He wants to do. Those who wait until they feel ready will wait forever. Those who step forward despite uncertainty will see God move in ways they never imagined. The choice is simple: wait for certainty and remain where you are, or take the first step in faith and see where God leads.